Hello and welcome to the Raw Dad Podcast. Today my guest on the show is Geoff Ralston. Geoff is the guy who invented Yahoo Mail. He's also a founder of many startups and now a partner at Y Combinator, an infamous Silicon Valley tech incubator that invested in companies such as Dropbox, Weebly, Stripe, Airbnb, and many others. Personally, Geoff is one of my favorite partners at Y Combinator because he's firm but kind. He'll quickly and honestly tell you exactly what he thinks about what you're doing, and then he'll help you fix it. I am really excited to have Geoff here today. Enjoy the show.
I started off as a computer scientist or a programmer. I'm convincing some of the programmers I know to start calling themselves computer scientists because it sounds cooler. But anyway, I got a degree in computer science and became a programmer out in Silicon Valley and worked as a programmer for quite a long time. Always dreaming of being an entrepreneur, But, you know, one thing led to another, and I had a great career. I started off at Hewlett-Packard, and I got a bunch of great opportunities, and I went back to school with HP sort of a couple of times and got two different degrees, one a master's in computer science and one an MBA. And so a whole bunch of time passed before I really got to, to feed my entrepreneurial need. But I finally did that in the early 90s when the internet craze hit, and my timing was pretty good. And I ended up with a company that did a bunch of things, but eventually created this web-based email product called Rocket Mail, which turned into Yahoo Mail when we were acquired in the late 90s by Yahoo. And then I spent a bunch of time at Yahoo, almost 9 years, running a group I sort of skipped over the fact that I sort of transitioned from being a programmer to a manager, although I never stopped programming. Programming was always my first love. And in every job I've ever had, I kept on programming, but it was certainly not the major part of my job after that. And at Yahoo, indeed, I had management roles, and I managed a team in the engineering organization. I became a general manager of division and then the chief product officer over those 9 years, but eventually left in 2006 to start off doing a whole bunch of different things. But I really wanted to start my own company in the educational technology space, but decided that the time wasn't right for a variety of reasons and started doing a lot of angel investing and hanging out with my old friend Paul Graham at Y Combinator. I knew Paul because his company had been purchased in just a year after my company at Yahoo. And so we'd known each other at Yahoo and kept in touch. And he was a natural person to hang out with a little bit when you start doing angel investing, because he was starting to become sort of a guru in the startup investing space. And I ended up, when I was the seed investor, the original investor in a company that I ended up becoming the CEO of for a couple of years. And that company got sold to Apple. And I spent a little bit of time with Apple, but left Apple and came back to education when I left Apple, and with a couple of co-founders started an educational technology accelerator. And we did that with Paul's help because he thought it was a great idea. And at the same time, he recruited me to be a partner at YC. So in 2011, I became a partner at YC and founded an educational technology accelerator, which was really modeled purposely with Paul's help after YC. Which was a smart thing to model it after, of course, because it was the first and really, I think, the best accelerator, the best early funder of startups in bulk there was. And Imagine K-12, which was the name of our educational technology accelerator, did really well. But for a variety of reasons, after 5 years, during that whole time, I was also a partner at YC. My partner at the time, Tim Brady, and I decided to merge Imagine K-12 in with YC. That was in 2016. And so now, as of now, I am solely a partner at YC, but Imagine K-12 and EdTech focus is still there. It's a vertical focus within YC. That was a pseudo capsule summary, I guess. Mm-hmm. Maybe longer than I meant it to be.
It's all good. I mean, it's a long history, and I'm actually really curious because in a way, you're not a
typical founder the image of a typical founder that's been sold around the valley of, 18-year-old who just dropped out of everything and started $1 billion company. You actually had a really good career before you ventured out into the startup world.
It's actually a little bit of a misconception. The average age of a founder at YC is over 27. And I was a little older than that when I finally got going with my first company in my early 30s, which is a little old to do it. In fact, I always tell people that you're probably, for most folks, the best time to do a startup, to start a company is sort of 22 to 32, 22 to 35, depending on what happens in your life. So I was maybe a little on the high side, but not as much as you might think.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, yeah, who was it? What's up, right? The founder was in his mid-30s when he started the company, and they sold.
Yeah, Jan Koum, who the founders from WhatsApp are a good example. They're two guys I know very well from their Yahoo guys.
Oh, that's right.
And yeah, they were there. I think Jan might have even been 40 or close when I started. There's a lot of founders who are older. There's no question. Stuart Butterfield was in his 40s when he started Slack, right? Especially founders of enterprise companies. So there's a bit of a range, and it kind of depends. It doesn't mean that we should write off the 22-year-olds or 18-year-olds. I've known incredible founders at that age, and I've known incredible founders who are older, but it does sort of skew a little younger just because of the exigencies of the job of startup founder. It tends to skew younger.
Well, it helps to be younger to sleep or not sleep, and work for 100 hours a week.
I think that's part of it, although I would argue it's less about the ability to work hard and spend the time and have the energy to do that, but more about the fact that you just don't have that much else in your life to do. So you don't have distractions. You don't have children and a wife usually, and all sorts of other dependencies that distract you from this incredible focus you need to do it. And that doesn't mean, again, that some people with all those things can't focus, but the hard part of it is that usually something has to give. Mm-hmm. And often for the very best founders, it's their personal life and their family life, and that's a tough one.
Absolutely agree. And one thing that I've heard from a lot of founders who are dads now, that they said they became a lot better at managing their time once they became parents, because you have to.
Because you have to, right?
Juggle.
You always become better at things when you have no choice.
Maybe that's a management trick. Just put yourself in a position where you have no choice, and then you'll automatically become really
good. It is
good
absolutely a parenting trick, right? If you want your kids to make the right decision, don't give them too many choices. Not that you shouldn't give your kids choices, but at some point, helping that, if you want to help them make the right choice, limit the possibilities.
Oh, for sure. Because if you give them two choices, then it's easy for them to choose one or the other, and it's still a choice. But if you give them 20, then it's overwhelming, and then the kids don't really know what to pick. Actually, speaking about teaching kids something, let's talk about your childhood and how it shaped you as a person, because I bet there were things from your parents and the way you were brought up that really influenced who you are today.
I had a really good childhood. I had our family life was, for the most part, pretty happy. We had 4 kids. I was the second of 4, 3 boys and a girl. And my dad was a professor of computer science at the State University of New York at Buffalo. And my parents were, I think they had their pros and cons as parents. They weren't, I don't think, ideal parents, but they were at the same time great parents. And, we had family dinners every night, and we had great conversations, and we played games as families, and we had amazing trips. As a family, we lived overseas as a family. I only did it once, but they actually lived overseas several times, and my younger siblings lived overseas for a year at a time more than once. My dad would take sabbaticals every 7 years, and we had a great time.
So was your dad a professor?
Yeah, he was a professor of computer science.
Oh, wow. Is that what led you to do computer science, or it was just kind of the right career choice, but not really influenced by your dad?
I think it would be silly to say it wasn't an influence. When I was in college, I did not go there at all with the intention of studying computer science. However, I had no idea really what I was going to study, but in the end, computer science came fairly easily to me, and it was certainly the path. I struggled with that because it was the path of least resistance. It was too easy. It felt like I ought to be struggling more, but I didn't. So I majored in computer science. Back in the day, in fact, it's interesting. I have an AB in computer science, or a BA. It was called AB because I went to Dartmouth and they're pretentious, and it's, the Latin is Artis Baccalaureus as opposed to BA. But back then it was in the math department, which was considered an art as opposed to a science. Although that's changed there and in almost every computer science department in the country now.
Well, at least you didn't get a BS degree.
Yeah, exactly. I did not get a BS degree. I did get an MS degree in computer science later when I was out in California, but that was a few years later.
So just a little bit about the past, and not to reveal your age, but how do you think, family life changed in the last couple of decades? I get a feeling that back when you were growing up, I think family was important, but it was a different kind of importance. Like maybe it was a little bit colder on the inside. It's just my view of kind of the past, but you said it was happy, but
I would never characterize it that way. I don't think there was a colder thing. I do think sort of the traditional relationship between parents and children has shifted over time. That for sure, in general, the dad is more engaged. That I certainly changed a gazillion more diapers than my dad ever did, and was more involved in all aspects of my kids' growing and nurturing than he was. That was just, the standard typical American home life was the dad came and the dad went out and worked. Mom stayed at home with the kids. And, when dad came home, he would, get ready. We'd have dinner. We'd talk then. And then he'd go back. My dad always went and worked for a while before we did anything. But we had a very warm family. And I think that's true, or as warm as my parents could be, given their own, issues and neuroses, but we had a warm family. And I think that's not what's different. It's just that the split between mom and dad, and maybe dads are more effusive a little bit, but I don't think the overall life I wouldn't progress, just more demonstrative perhaps than it was in the past. And more of the warmth came from mom just per force, and it's maybe a little more evenly balanced, but I wouldn't say it was warmer. I think the main difference that I would point out, the main challenge for today's parents has shifted. Back in our day, the main challenge, I think, for our parents was TV. Like, it was kind of a relatively, not a new thing, but programming shifted rapidly in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up. And, and it was a challenge. Like, kids wanted to watch, TV is this incredibly absorbing thing, and kids wanted to watch a lot of it. And my dad actually rebelled against this and did everything he could to ration us from TV, even though, he really wanted TV because he wanted to watch sports and news, things like that. But and little else really. But today, just as an example, when my wife and I were building the house that we're in now, and all my kids grew up in, we said for sure, responding to the the challenges that we knew our parents had, no TVs in bedrooms. Mm-hmm. TV's okay, but we want to watch as a family. We're gonna make sure that if we do a TV thing, it's a family thing. And it didn't matter, because by the time my kids were 10 years old, they each had like 3 TVs in each room, because they had a phone, they had a laptop, and they had, a tablet or access to all those things. And we didn't know what to do about that. And I don't think parents have figured it out. And I think the isolation that new media and new devices brings to families is crazy hard for parents to deal with.
I wholeheartedly agree. It's virtually impossible, because everywhere you go, there's a TV, there's a screen, there's some kind of a device.
You see that all the time. I mean, it's a societal thing. You walk around and you look at people, and everyone's, go on any mass transit, anywhere people are absorbed in their device all the time. When I go back to my college and I see people walking around, they're walking around looking at their device all the time. It didn't used to be like that. You'd walk around and your head would be up and you'd be saying hello to people. And it's, one of the great challenges of our time, I think, how to be present in the world and cyberspace. Maybe not simultaneously, but in balance.
Well, just a personal observation. It's not only is it extremely absorbent, but I think a lot of people maybe don't want to make a correlation between devices and behavior. But we've certainly noticed that the days when our daughter, the older one, is exposed to a device, even for a short period of time, her just emotional state goes completely out of whack. And all it is a correlation, but at least we've seen it, because we don't usually give her a phone or a TV or anything. But even if you give her a phone to look at pictures for 10, 20 minutes, next thing you know, 2 hours later, she's throwing a tantrum, which never usually happens. It's because the competition, basically anything in real life, can't compete with screen, because screen is just so easy.
Yeah, I mean, there's an adult equivalent to that. Watch someone who, forgot his phone somewhere. It's an immediate, pseudo tantrum. Oh my God, where's my phone? Where is my phone? How, we've all been that way. Like, oh, I left without my phone. Jeez. Actually,
what am I going to do for the day, right?
It's liberating to be without your phone in a weird way. I was actually impressed with my son, who's 20 now. He was out, doing what 20-year-olds do, which is sort of, going out with his friends. Undoubtedly, even though he's a year underage, there was alcohol involved, but he lost his phone. And he thought it might show up. So he forced himself to be without a phone for 3 days and accepted that before, giving up and getting a new one. And it was kind of neat, because, you would see him, and instead of having to take his attention away from his phone, you could just talk to him, which was nice. And, he kind of agreed. That didn't mean that as soon as he got a new phone, it wasn't right back into the way we all are. But, I think this is perhaps the ultimate challenge for new parents.
So you said your son, is he the oldest? Yes. Or so he's 20, right? Is he I guess that's college age.
Yeah, he's a sophomore.
How challenging is that? And this is for all our parents, listeners with older kids, right, who are going to have their college age kids soon. What do you see changing over the last maybe decade that he was growing up, from like a little baby to now fully grown adult doing his thing?
Well, a decade isn't from little baby. A decade is from a decade ago. He was almost 6 feet, and my size. He wasn't a little baby. So, so I'm sure you wanted that to be a narrow question, and it was way too broad because, like, you just asked me from a little baby to now, what changed? Everything, nothing. Because what I have found, perhaps one of the biggest attitude changes I've had towards parenting is before I was a parent, what I thought my attitude would be, and now is that I'm a bigger believer in nature over nurture than I used to be, and so many of the traits that we, noticed in my son from when he was a little baby or a toddler to now have remained consistent. That, in many ways, your children are the people who they are from a very, very young age. But of course, everything has changed. Everything, in every way. And your worries change, your focus changes, their focus changes. So that's about the best way I can answer that question over that scope.
Well, I guess what I'm curious as, and Jen, my wife, and we were just talking the other day how our oldest is just 3 years old, but we already got to pick a new future school for her, and that choice sounds easy, but not so much, because what you pick now could lead or not lead to Stanford, 15 years from now.
Well, let me tell you, I think. Well, I remember distinctly my dad basically saying, 0 to 5 doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter what you do. It's all kind of 0 to 5, grade 0. I should say kindergarten to grade 5, is irrelevant, not age 0 to 5. Kindergarten to grade, it's like elementary school, just doesn't matter. It's after that education really starts happening. But there's a lot of evidence that he was wrong. And I think it kind of depends on the kid, of course. This all depends. But there's also some pretty good evidence that, and this is a little shocking, that who your kindergarten teacher is predictive of your future salary. Some evidence to that. In fact, I wouldn't make any claims to the actual veracity of that kind of wild sort of thing, but there's some data that backs that up, which is pretty stunning if you're a parent. It just makes you worry more, because that just meant for them, they didn't worry that much about it. But yeah, I do think that I do think it's gone way overboard, though. Like, people are so insanely focused on getting your kid into the right preschool, and I just think that puts. One of the real flaws, I think, is that we all put way too much pressure on ourselves and our kids way too early now. And I do think that the simplicity of some of those decisions back in the day took pressure off in a way that was helpful to both parents and kids. Stress is, in most cases, stress lowers your IQ. As an adult or as a child. And literally, if you give a stressed person an IQ test and you give a calm person an IQ test, the same person an IQ test, the same test, or the same version of the test, when they're calm, they'll do better. They'll have a higher IQ. And that's something to think about.
Also a great way to hack tests.
That's why there's these drugs like Ritalin are so popular amongst kids, because you can medicate yourself to do better on tests, and you don't take uppers to do that. You take something that calms your mind down so that you can focus, because focus improves your IQ, at least the way we measure IQ now. We all feel that, right? That's what caffeine does. We know when we're about doing something and we're caffeinated, all of a sudden, we just focus in and we have energy, but it's not like crazy. Certainly, we also know if we have too much caffeine and we're jittery, we have a harder time, but just the right amount really helps us, right?
I guess that explains the Balmer peak, right? Where you just caffeinated enough, but also under the influence of alcohol enough that you balance that state for longer.
Yeah, well, I don't want to comment on that. There's too many chemicals there for me to make any comment on, but But I do think we all know, like, that first cup of coffee while Jazz were doing great. If you have that fourth cup of coffee, not a good idea for any reason. All of a sudden, you're like jumping. You build ADD into yourself by doing that, and then it's hard to accomplish things.
Hard part with parenting, really, what you do today doesn't show up for a couple of years or maybe a couple of decades.
Yeah, it's like investing in startups, right? You're investing in your own startup, and you won't know the results not for a couple of years, but for a decade or more. It's true, and I do think that's one of the complicated things. There is these little beasts, these little human machines do not come out with a manual. I always thought that was kind of shocking. Where we've all had that experience with the first baby, where you sort of can't believe they just kind of check you out of the hospital, and you're sitting there with this thing, and then you get home, and you're like, "What do we do with it?" Oh my God, and anything that happens, you ask yourself, we don't know what to do in this situation. Like, what do I do? And so whatever you call your parents, your friends or whatever, and eventually you figure it out. And then for the second baby, I still remember so vividly taking my first baby out to the car and incredibly awkwardly and gently, like putting him in his child's seat. It took like 5 minutes to get all the buckles just right and figure it. My first time I'd ever done it, right? And I was so worried about hurting his arm and his leg, and I put him in. The second child, you just kind of slap him in there, and you're done, right?
Yes. But it's amazing that it's been 20 years, but you remember that moment.
Oh, I remember it so distinctly.
Yeah. But what you're describing is exactly what I just heard a couple of months ago from a friend who just had a newborn. Exactly the same story of like, I'm not really sure. This thing, it's so fragile. Like his comment was, "Can we even take highway?"
Exactly. I mean, you don't know. And every stage is a little bit that way. It's like your kid's 2.5 years old on the floor screaming and crying as if the world is about to end, and you're thinking, what do I do? I cannot, this is not at his cerebral cortex is not fully developed enough for me to actually have a conversation about this. And, it's hard enough to have a conversation with an adult that's angry. It's impossible to have a conversation with a child that's angry. A toddler that's angry, forget it. So what do you do? And it's a conundrum that every parent will run into, because that's just a developmental thing that happens, and you have to muddle your way through it. Really exciting when it happens in public, right?
Well, at the end of the day, public or not, to me personally, it's just an environment, and how you feel as a parent it's all your feelings. Your toddler has no concept of it being in public, right? It's just she's having an issue. But I went to a couple of classes on positive parenting, and I think what was shocking there to a lot of parents was that most of the time it's really not about your child, it's about you. And in the case of a toddler's throwing a tantrum, like really you as a parent need to come down and figure things out first before they can, because they don't have the emotional capability to deal with what's going on with them right now.
It's interesting you say that, because I think if there's one most important lesson I've learned about parenting at every age is it's not about you. I have a 20-year-old. The whole process of a child growing up is them separating from their parents and creating their own place in the world and their own life. And for the 20-year-old, I'm pretty involved still. We're talking about what he's doing this summer, and I'm still paying the bills, and we take vacations together still, and we still have a life together. But he is, when he comes home, and he's really excited to come home and see his parents, then he's out the door, right? He's got a separate life, and it's about him. And it's not about me. It's just not about like my life anymore. It's about his life. And that's equally true when you're thinking about how as you said, how you're dealing with a toddler. And it's very complicated because we have just as many emotions and reactions as they do. And you're children can be, unintentionally cruel to you and mean to you and ignore you. And it's not about you. And, you have to, it's hard. I think since we're all human beings, it's fair to say we all fail. I know I have failed many, many times on that score, but, we put our own hopes and our own fears and our own emotions as a layer on top of everything about them. And that colors how we treat our children in ways that lots of times is more about us than them. And that's almost always a bad strategy.
That's really excellent advice for everyone to write down and remember. And it's hard to remember, especially when they get emotional and you get emotional, right? You have to remember that you have to come down first and you have to.
Well, yeah. And you know what? There's this impossible line that you think that you're always thinking about. And maybe for me anyway, maybe some parents, I think different parents have different clarity on this line. Where do you say, oh, this is about me. I need to let them deal or be, let them get up themselves, pick themselves up off the ground or I need to respond in a certain way. Or you say, no, this is my parental duty. They may not do that. Your daughter is 15 and going out wearing something you consider inappropriate. When do you say something and when do you not? And geez, today that's hard. I have no real guidance as to where I should step in and where I shouldn't. And a lot of times when I think I should step in, my wife looks at me and says, "You're nuts. What are you doing?" And I have to, and that causes me, gives me real pause. So it's a continuous hard battle. And I'll just go back to what I said before. There's no manual. and even if there were a manual, it would be out of date instantly. My parents were struggling with the manual of how do you deal with this crazy media that suddenly is engulfing your children. We have this incredibly, to the nth degree. What do we do? Well, the good news is there's guidance. The bad news is no one knows if the guidance is really right or effective. Because there's, in every generation, and more so now because things change faster than they used to, but every generation you conduct experiments with no controls on your children. We're just doing it now, and it's a live experiment, and we're just kind of improvising as we go along and trying to do the right thing by our kids. Yeah, I used to say that a lot of the innovation that we funded was incremental for the simple reason that if you do radical stuff, you're basically doing radical stuff to children. And, you can sort of imagine your kids are this age, but imagine walking up to a school and, you take pick your age, your 6-year-old into first grade and, you hand them off at the school and they say, "Hey, good news. We've changed everything. We have no idea if it's going to work, but this is the first class and we're going to experiment on your children." Cool, right? And you'd be horrified and grab your child back and take them back home and find a school that wasn't going to experiment on your child, right? But of course, the truth is we're experimenting all the time, and nobody knows precisely what the outcome is. Just like, Carol, and here's the hard thing, just like we don't even know really what world our kids are going to be coming of age in. It's changing so rapidly. What's it going to be like? What jobs are going to be available? How are they going to live a happy and successful and productive, good life? What will that mean in 10, 15, 20, 30 years? I don't know.
So how do you prepare your kids if even you don't actually know what this world is going to look like?
You want the answer, right? It's a hard one. I guess the only thing you can do, and this is what I tell my kids, is you better be flexible. You better be good at learning. You better expect change because you're going to get it. And some of that change is going to be hard. So you better be resilient. And I don't know that I've been remarkably successful in building grit and resilience and flexibility into my kids for the simple reason that, a lot of that stuff is, like I said, a big proponent of nature over nurture, but you can do what you can do. I have a friend who tells me, you can teach compassion. There's ways to do that. You need to think about that. And so even things like compassion, which I don't know how some of that is certainly hereditary and some of it is learned, but you try to teach your kids everything you can and project everything you can and model everything you can and hope in the end that the right stuff sticks, not the wrong stuff, because we'll model wrong stuff too. Unfortunately, all of us manage to do that as well.
It's a great point, because kids mirror us so much, and every time you do something poorly or exhibit negative behavior, they pick it up just as fast as all the good things. So again, it comes back to us, right? On being good parents and leading by example.
Yeah.
So where does Imagine K-12 come in all of this? What's the role of that? I guess, should we call it the YC education stream now, or is it still?
That's what it is. Okay. Yeah. Imagine K-12 is a track within YC, an ed tech track where we take we work with the ed tech companies that are in each batch, and the ed tech companies in YC as a whole, and do what we can to help them be successful.
Did you start it originally because you were frustrated with something about your own kids' education, or it just seemed like a really good thing to bring into the world?
Well, there broadly speaking, there were two reasons we started Imagine K-12. One was because it was pretty obvious that technology should have a role in education. Our kids were being educated in a sense with technology and inundated with information, knowledge of a sort, right and wrong knowledge all the time. Unless they were in school, in which case at the time it was like you check your technology at the door and there's nothing there. And that didn't make sense. My partners and I had been part of the genesis of the internet age, and we were thinking, this is ridiculous. It can't, the schools need to open up to this technology and make use of it. It's going to radically change the way kids learn, and by the way, it's changing the world. So schools have to be cognizant of that, and they should change their products to help kids be prepared for this brand new world. And there's huge opportunity there, because everything isn't working the way we think it should work in education, especially in America. And this maybe has, technology can ameliorate things where they're bad and improve things in every case. Secondly, I think if you want to have a positive impact on the world and society as a whole, there's no better place to focus than education. And if you want to improve people's lives and prospects, education is where you start, right? Or at least one of the key places you start. So for those reasons, Imagine, ed tech was a natural place for me to go after, being pretty fortunate and getting to be part of some really cool things and having the ability to make some choices.
Speaking of making impact, here's something that happened to me the other day. I went on Reddit, and in one of the forums on teaching, I asked, what would it take to get rid of books? Because to me, when I was growing up, I remember carrying a lot of books to school, and they were heavy and kind of highly unnecessary, and very often you don't even need those books in school, but you still have to bring them over, etc. And going forward in the future, I see us carrying our own iPad and having all the books on the iPad, or something along those lines. So, but a lot of responses I got on the forum were along the lines of like, oh no, we can't get rid of books. Paper is great. You want to touch your pages, that kind of stuff. Maybe books or maybe something else. But what do you think we can do over the next 5 to 10 years to make the biggest impact on education?
My daughter has back problems thanks to lugging around 20 or 30 pounds of books all the time. It's ridiculous. Like it's the stupidest thing ever. But also, you put your science book out there and it's immediately obsolete. Mm-hmm. And, instead of having a video of how a volcano works, it's a picture, which isn't as good. And, someday instead of having a video, you'll be able to step into the volcano in virtual reality, which will be better. So they're just not as good as we can do. So of course we're going to get rid of them. Because that that video of a volcano weighs nothing. You don't have to carry around, and you can see it anywhere, and you can bring it with you and put it in your pocket. It's way better than a book. And when I can have thousands of those videos and put them in my pocket, of course, paper will go away. And I sympathize with the people who love paper and think it's a beautiful thing. And, it will still exist in limited amounts, but the sad truth is that's the past. However, those things are good, but I don't, transforming education is a lot bigger and more complex than that. It still probably starts with making better teachers and figuring out ways we can make better teachers. And by the way, there's a technological aspect to that too, which you might not expect, but that's purely because technology allows you to measure things and make things transparent that it was hard to do in the past. So we can figure out ways to help teachers become better at their craft, and frankly, figure out which teachers really aren't going to be able to make it as in the new world, and figure that out for them and for us. And there's other societal things we need to do. There's nothing to do with technology and teachers, but we need to make teaching be as prestigious a job as we possibly can, maybe the most prestigious job in our society. And once we get there, then the prospects for the future standard of living and the future prospects for the United States of America, just doing that, if we could do that somehow, would radically shift. But there's other aspects to preparing kids for the 21st century. There's different things we should teach them. We should teach everyone how computer science works and how technology works. And we should be much more flexible and much more personalized and adaptive. And all those things will help kids have better outcomes and therefore have better prospects in their lives. So there are transformative things we can do with education, but we can't forget that as parents and as people who want to impact the education world, is that these things have a lot of inertia for good reason. Think back to that scenario I gave you where you drop your kid off at, a lab that's going to experiment on them, and what sort of reticence you might have to that sort of thing. There's a great story that Diane Taverner, who's the founder of Summit Public Schools, tells. Summit's an incredibly innovative school system, and she's doing amazing things, and I love what they're doing. And one of the things they're doing is that each child has a personalized learning plan, a PLP, and it's different, it's complicated. And when they implemented this, there was a lot of pushback from the entire community, from parents, from teachers, and from kids, because it was different, and it was very deep and very hard to deal with, and they found themselves unprepared in unexpected ways. For example, she tells a story about how she came home and had this really moment of conflict with her husband because he was trying to help their child who was in the school with their math and was lost as to how to do it. Because, it used to be your son's doing algebra or something, and you're a little rusty. You grab the textbook, you see where they are, you help them out. This was different. And there are massive challenges like that. I mean, it was her thing. It was her school. It was her path to change, which was incredibly great and positive, but hard to implement. So these things are complex and difficult, and I hope inevitable.
And you just pointed out something subtly in a way, but I feel like parents with higher income and maybe more time on their hands, or more better ability to buy time, right? They can actually invest more in their children in these ways. But maybe a way to look at technology is that for parents who don't have as much money, technology can bring all these experiences to more kids, right? Where you can't have fancy schools, where you can't have tutors, but if you can substitute that with tech, you can really give amazing science and math and everything experiences to kids who otherwise wouldn't get it because they're stuck in some poor school, with no funding. By the way,
I think that's an awesome point. I do think, look, there's a lot of fear that technology can actually exacerbate the achievement gap that exists in the United States today, especially if you look at communities of color versus Caucasian communities, Asian communities, et cetera. But I believe firmly that if we do this intentionally as a society, if we take steps intentionally as a society, we can use technology as a great leveler. Maybe it's impossible to level completely, but it can be a great leveler to make our society much more of a meritocracy, to re-implement social mobility, which is actually incredibly tragically almost died out in America today. Your situation at birth has an extraordinary high probability of determining your outcome in life, and that's wrong. No one in America believes in that. The American dream is that anyone from any strata of society or economic level can do anything, and it's not so true anymore. And I really believe that technology has the potential to help us re-implement that. I think it's critical for the future of our country and our standard of living and for future generations. So I really hope it's true anyway.
Well, you're making it true with what I see and imagine.
I hope we're playing a role in that, even if it's a small one. I hope that's true. I
mean, remember Clever? They were in my batch in summer 12, and they seem to be in 90% of schools in America now. So I think it's small steps that make really huge proud. Impact.
Yeah, I know Tyler and Dan and Clever, and those guys are awesome, and they're doing an incredible job. I'm actually very proud to say that if you look at Imagine K-12 companies and the products they have created, they're in essentially every school in the United States and many, many, many schools around the world. And that's great. But change has been incremental so far. And we'd really, we need as a society need to make more transformational change to really squeeze out that achievement gap, to really bring the United States up to where it can and should be, and bring our achievement up here and the rest of the world. There's more than 1 billion children in the world, and we should all have as a goal that each and every one of them have the resources they need to improve their outcomes, improve their expectations for a good life, and that starts with education. And by the way, healthcare. If we can get healthy, educated kids everywhere in the world, the entire world will be a much better place.
I don't want to get too political, but going back
we're supposed to be talking about parenting here, right?
We are, but once you touch education and healthcare, it's you're basically both feet are in politics. But I'm just curious, back to you growing up, do you think there was actually more focus on being educated back then than there is now?
No, I don't. In 1981, President Reagan created a task force to analyze the state of American education. Get that? Think about how long ago that was. This task force came out with a pretty damning report, pretty famous phrase that came out of that said that if the state of American education today had been imposed on the United States by a foreign power, we would have considered it an act of war. That maybe has some resonance with what foreign powers are doing in our election system in the United States today. But just think about that. This was, that's the era that I was growing up and being educated in. The United States implemented public education way early. We understood the impact of education and how important it was. We understand the importance. We understand what our priorities should be in this country. We just do a remarkably poor job of putting our money where our priorities are or ought to be, putting our resources behind what our priorities ought to be. And the result of that is tragic, in my opinion. This is all in my opinion, of course.
Of course, but it's not too far from the truth.
You know, I was just talking to some parents from a school where we want our oldest to go to next year. And it's an alternative school, so they don't have standard curriculum, and they do a lot of cool things. But one thing they said, 90% of kids will end up getting tutored after school, because at the end of the school, they'll still need to pass standardized tests in order to get to the next level, whichever it is, middle school, something like that. And so kids graduate and do really well after the school, but that's because parents are able to send them to the school and pay for tutoring. And we still have a lot of work to do where society as a whole can actually progress together at this really high level. And hopefully this is where technology can really come in and level the playing field.
Look, again, it's a bit of a far field from parenting, but my hope is that it'll always be true that wealthy people will have more resources to put against the education of their children than poor people, and because they have those resources and they will put them there. But just take that one example that you can hire a private tutor or you can have your kid take classes for SAT that might be very expensive, thousands of dollars. But if you can create an online tool that will prepare your kid equally or even better than a human tutor, that's way cheaper. Wow. Like, why isn't that great? Isn't that an example of technology being a great leveler? I don't know that we'll ever achieve complete equality, but if we can, look, our goal should be as much equality of future outcomes for children as possible, without doing police state kind of things, which I think is wrong. People ought to be able to spend their money how they want. Then, I just want to make it hard for people to figure out ways to spend money so that the rich kids get a leg up over the poorer kids. Wouldn't it be great if it really was about, to paraphrase Martin Luther King, the content of their abilities as opposed to the content of their wallets?
It would be for a lot of people. But before we have to go, let's just finish on a maybe brighter and less political note.
Yeah.
This is something I really wanted to know more about. You, at some point, you said your parents took you and your siblings overseas to travel. And at some point, you took your kids, I believe it was to Spain for a year.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you tell us about that experience, what you learned, how your kids enjoyed this, and kind of what was the purpose and what they got out of it?
Well, yeah, I lived in the United Kingdom for a year when I was 11 years old, and it was a transformative year for me. The way I like to tell it, when as you get older, it's harder and harder to really, if you think back to, even when you're in your 20s and 30s, and certainly in your 40s and your 50s, and you try to think back of what it was like being an 11-year-old kid or 12-year-old kid, or actually even what happened to you during those times, it's really difficult. Like, try to think back and think of a sequence of things that happened when you were 12 years old, and think of more than a few days, unless something really stood up, something spectacular happened. It's hard to remember it. And, when I was 10 to 11, I can tell you hardly anything that happened there. And when I was 13 and 14, I can tell you hardly anything. I really I could dredge up some memories, but it'd be hard. But that year, I could talk to you for hours about stuff we did that year. Even today, it stands out in my mind in bold in ways that it's hard to describe. And I wanted my kids to have that kind of experience as well. And And that's why when I finally got a chance to do it, a little later than I would have hoped. My kids were a little older than I would have hoped, but within the right range, I think. I took it, and even though it's actually a pretty complex, big thing to extract yourself for even a year and live overseas and make it all happen and get your kids in school and figure out how you're going to live and all that stuff, and just getting all the bureaucratic paperwork done that you need to get done to make it happen. We both, I think, massively succeeded and ran into complications that we didn't expect. And like in every case, one of my children had a really hard time in Spain. He didn't want to go. He's not the most flexible child in the world. And he still says he hated it. It was terrible. It was a terrible year. Although increasingly, he's older now. Increasingly, he's appreciates the experience he got there and is leveraging them. And like I said, it still was a kind of a painful year for him. And when your kid isn't happy, it's hard to be happy as parents. Although we were. I mean, everyone sort of had incredible experiences, but that was a complication I just didn't expect. Didn't think that was going to happen, but it did.
How did you help him to stick with it for a year? Year is a long time, especially for a kid.
Oh my gosh, it was hard. It was hard. I tried everything, and I don't know that anything ever worked. Sometimes we were very hard on him and just said, this is your life. This is your family. Come along with it. Sometimes we allowed him, we put him in control. I took him over there. I thought this was actually going to make a bigger difference than it did. I took him over there while he was saying, I don't want to go. I'm not going. I am not going to Spain with you. I'm staying here, right? He was young, right? He was a 10-year-old kid. Or maybe 9. I have to think. Maybe he was 9 at the time. Anyway, I took him over there and allowed him to actually choose the house that, we looked at a bunch of houses and I allowed him to choose the house. So we put him in as much control. Your kids have no control over almost anything in their lives. And so the more control you can give them, the stronger and more empowered they feel. And so we tried to give him more control over his life. We let him plan a vacation while we were over there. We tried to give him control, and that helped. But, it wasn't perfect.
Did they go to an international school out there, or was it really just a normal Spanish school?
No, we put them in an international school, and there's a lot to be said about that, pros and cons. But if you do immersion in a language that your kids don't speak at the time, and you're only there for one school year, unless your kid is truly exceptional, it's basically a lost year academically, and you have to be prepared to deal with that and make up for it. You might have to repeat the whole year when you go home. And that's another reason for a kid to rebel massively and to have a hard time and maybe not such a good time. So parents do that, and it sometimes works out and sometimes it doesn't. It depends on how much. We decided not to take on that sort of risk. And it's especially complicated where we stayed in Barcelona because the kids there speak Catalan, not Castellano. And so if you want your kids to learn Spanish instead of Catalan you don't want to put that, if you're going to put them in a situation where they have to do both and you're only staying 1 year, that's a challenge that goes beyond. Yeah. It's too much for a kid. That won't work. So we know kids who have done that, but they've stayed for 2, 3, 4 years.
So if you were to do it again, would you go for 2 or 3 years?
It just wasn't feasible at the time I was doing this. I was right in the middle of founding Imagine K-12, and it was already a big challenge. So, the best way to do this is to plan on staying 2 years. There's an old saying I like to, well, that's an old saying. It's my old saying. My saying is that, maybe I heard it from someone, I can't remember, which is that, if you go for 1 year, after 1 year, the parents want to stay and the kids all want to go home. If you stay for 2 years, the parents want to go home and the kids want to stay.
Beautiful.
It's a great experience.
Yeah, and not a lot of people do it, especially. Well, I mean, it's expensive, challenging, and jobs and schools, all of that tie you in. But I think, if you can do it, that's definitely something worth it. What do you think was the right age to take your kids on such?
I think you want them to be old enough to remember it and appreciate it, and young enough not to feel like you're completely destroying their lives. So that's sort of late elementary school, early middle school is the optimal, if that's where your kids are. It's hard when you have multiple kids. So, sort of 5th grade through 7th or 8th grade is best.
Okay.
High school is really hard. Plenty of parents do it and you can do it, but it's hard.
Lucky for parents, parenting is already hard, so you kind of get used to doing hard things after a while. Well, Geoff, thank you very much for being on the podcast. I've learned a ton, and I hope our listeners did too. Before we go, is there anything that you'd like to reiterate in case people forget, that one thing that they should really remember?
I'll just reiterate the lesson that I think is most fundamental, that I think all parents know, but sometimes it's impossible and too easy to forget, which is it's about your kids. It's about them and not you. And try to understand when you're putting your own cares and needs in front of your kids in ways that's probably and not their best interest. It's all worth it.
That's great to hear. All right. Well, thank you for being on the podcast. And if listeners want to help with the YC EdTech track or something like that, is there a place they should go to?
They should feel free to reach out to me at Geoff, Geoff, at ycombinator.com.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good talking to you. Good catching up.
Oh, hey there. Just before you go, I've got one favor to ask. If you like this episode of The Rad Dad Show, please grab a link to the episode and send it to 3 of your friends. Email, tweet, text, whatever. Just let them know that it was fun to listen to and you think they'd get some value out of it. And of course, if you want to send me some private feedback, feel free to email editor@raddadshow.com and I'll be happy to chat with you. Until next time.